I don't know how many of you have seen Star Wars. Probably a lot of you. I'm sure you've seen those epic lightsaber battles, and they're jinking around, turning, doing all kinds of dance moves, and you might be wondering how realistic that is. And up next we have Scotty Harrison, who's going to talk about the science behind swordsmanship. So, round of applause for Scotty.
Oh, wait, are we on? Yeah, there we go. All right, cool. So I'm Scotty Harrison, and I wear many, many hats. Some of you may or may not have met me before in various different states of life. I also point out that at the moment I'm incredibly sleep deprived thanks to PhD research occurring this week for the first time in about 2 years. So, tonight I'm going to be presenting to you a scientific approach to swordsmanship, and this was really essentially inspired by just listening to the SGU and those guys talking about how to start off being skeptical about, the things in your world. And for me, I'd been studying Japanese swordsmanship for the last 6 years now. And I thought, well, what better place to start, because I know there's more than a few people who are willing to call certain elements of martial arts a little bit of bullshit. So, that in mind, I thought it would be interesting to look at Japanese swordsmanship in a scientific context, and essentially where we'll be going with this is giving you a little bit of a brief background as to the development of Japanese swordsmanship. During the 1300s, there was a great period of time where essentially Japan was getting marauded by China and that area, and as such, as time developed, the Japanese were required to develop their own martial systems. Prior to 1603, it was very much islands of warring clans and people who essentially were disagreeing on all sorts of things, mostly resource bases and other elements. But then the Edo period occurred in 1603, where the winners of a battle essentially established a military dictatorship that lasted 265 years, one of the longest reigns in terms of dynasties of peaceful periods that happened in Japan. And yes, it was economically and socially stable, however, it was also ruled with an iron fist. And this is the role, essentially, of where the samurai came in. They were the noble class. Interestingly enough, and side factoid, if you look historically, feudalism and the feudal system of Japan developed very similarly in terms of timelines as the feudal systems that were occurring in Europe. Yet, the Tokugawa shogunate was very much a closed-off dictatorship where they didn't want any relations with outside powers. So, one of the major motivations for my research was also looking at the communication of techniques. How was it that you would have a sword school and the passing on of these traditions from one person to another? And so when you look at how swordsmanship was really conducted, it was all about setting up schools where you would have a headmaster or a principal grandmaster of a school who would develop a series of techniques. And it was an oral tradition. Yes, the Japanese were an incredibly well educated society, especially in the samurai class, who would learn all about art, writing, calligraphy, and taking that into account, it is really of no surprise then that they really didn't write as much on swordsmanship until much later on in life, if they survived. So what tended to happen is that the swordsmanship and the techniques that were passed on from one person to another was very much in an oral tradition to really avoid, keep your competitive advantage. You didn't want perhaps someone else knowing how you go about conducting yourself in a sword fight or in a duel in such a way as to, lose your advantage in that fight from the outset. So what we really look at in a lot of ways is that, and this is sort of the first scientific concept I really think applies in this construct, is that techniques are subject to essentially evolutionary pressure. And it's a nice dichotomous breakdown. That is, you have a base set of techniques that work. However, they may not work forever because you're at some point going to have information about your sword school being disseminated, and other people will learn about how you conduct yourself in a sword fight. This starts losing your comparative advantage. So, you have to try new things. And in a sword fight, it goes one of two ways. You either try something new and it fails and you die, or you try something new and it works and you live. And this is this beautiful outcome. So it's very clear cut in a lot of ways. And if you live, then you survive to pass that technique on to another day and to another student. So when we look at the anatomy of swordsmanship, it really actually, there's a lot of aspects to it as far as the science is concerned. Looking at aspects such as the physics, the motion of both body and blade, how we move and position ourselves relative to our opponents, and also how we position the blade itself. This then also brings into construct the ideas of anatomy and how we target different parts of the body in a single sword strike and what we're actually aiming to do with that. You also have the metallurgy, the forging of the actual blade itself, and if anyone's interested, if you look at the history of how Japan came to creating essentially what is regarded as some of the finest steel in the world and the finest swords, it's an incredible tale, but that's probably a little bit outside the scope of what I would like to cover tonight. And then biomechanics. Obviously, this ties into, the aspect of physics of how we move our body, but it becomes a little bit more detailed. So the first video that I wanted to play, which I have a really bad feeling isn't going to play because I was up at, dare I say it, about 1 o'clock in the morning trying to embed this stuff. No, it's not going to play. All right, but it's basically a demonstration of a technique. Now, in lieu of perhaps not having the particular aspects of a video to demonstrate this, which I'd pre-recorded, perhaps I could just demonstrate it live on stage and see what happens using, this is sort of like a lightsaber. It's gonna, shoots red laser beams, which is probably actually more realistic. Anyway, all right. So to start off with my fake sword that I'm holding here in my right hand, I would start off, and in most traditions, you kneel down and you bow to your sword. There's very esoteric components. And they were stoic people, so you had to be upright in your posture. You had to be slightly off your ankles. And the idea is that you could cut out in a single strike. There's a laser beam over there somewhere, pointing towards my target. And then you'd raise the sword above your head and kiryosh, bring the sword down. And in that 2 strokes, you would strike down your opponent. Now that's the opening technique to our sword school. All different sword schools have different techniques. One of the things that really sort of fascinated me in a lot of ways was what was the physics of this single cut. Now the one I want to talk about is not the one that comes out first, but the kiryosh. The term in Japanese refers to essentially falling cut. So what made it this way? So when we look at the aspects of how to analyse the cut, I'm going to use the physics of circular motion. So to briefly explain this, we have the average speed, 2 pi r over t. Okay, 2 pi essentially helps capture the circular elements of circle measured in terms of radians. We have the radius. Now the radius in this is actually a very interesting element in terms of how we measure it. Realistically, if I wanted to get a little bit more complex and looking at the way sword motion actually works, it's not actually circular motion. It's more of an ellipse. But that just took way too many calculations, and my time last night was not happening. I'm going to stick with circular motion. And so the radius is from the pivot point of where the cut starts. And in the videos that I'd so hoped to show you, but isn't going to happen, you can see very clearly that in the first video I have a student who has only been training for about 3 or 4 classes. And in his cut, he would start raising the sword above his head and then coming down. Now the most important part of that is that the pivot point is at my shoulder. And that is essentially then the centre of my circle. And so the radius at which you're striking comes from the shoulder to the tip. So that was the major part, and I think we measured that on average to be around about 1.5 metres by the time you went from the shoulder to the tip of your sword. Now then we have acceleration, which is just a function of speed, and then finally force, which would then take into account the mass. So we kept, for my scientific experiment where I got some students to do this task repetitively until I had sufficient number of observations to make a conclusion, usually an n greater than 30 if you're using central limit theorem, then we know that the mass of the sword was held constant. It was about 1.2, 1.3 kilograms. And if you add the mass of both of your arms in terms of the calculation, if you're going from here, then you're adding about another 10 kilos or so. So, using these equations, we came to another video that was in slow motion and it looked really cool. You'll just have to take my word for it. But they did something like this, and the sword would go round and kill something here. Anyway, so from that, that's the second video. Hang on, wait. If I keep pressing this button, something may happen. No. There we go. There's our measurements. This was the scientific approach. I should also point out I'm an economist. Please don't hold it against me. So I'm not really a scientist. I'm a fake one. But I do pretend, and I do understand the basic principles. So we held mass constant, and the sampling rate was 25 frames per second because that was the camera I was using to capture these. And basically at every point we can take a measurement of the angle of the cut and essentially the time that it takes to get to the elements. And so one of the major variables as far as the cut is concerned is actually the time spent training. How long have you been training as a swordsman? Because then when we look at the results of what we got, student 1. This was our student who had been training for maybe a few lessons at most. And we see that the time it took for them to perform the cut was 1.16 seconds. Now that's not slow, people. You know, put this into context of your reaction times and your capacity to defend yourself in a battle. 1.16 seconds is quite fast. And we see that the average speed was about 8.12 meters per second. The acceleration from that, we got about 21 meters per second squared, and then finally they were conveying at the tip of the blade when it would strike the person about 235 newtons of force. That's actually a significant amount when you think that this is a 3-foot long razor blade coming at you. It's not nice. I think in a lot of ways, dare I say it, this is why I don't hold any magical disbeliefs of, you know, that I'm someday going to need this to defend myself. This is not a self-defense martial art. This is something that was very real historically that was used. And I'm only planning on using it the day I either take revenge on the Lannisters or the zombie apocalypse. So, we look at student number 2. So, you see here that it only took me about 0.52 seconds to actually make the cut. And we can see very quickly, as far as the average speed is concerned, it is nearly 2.5 times faster, obviously, because of the function of time goes through to acceleration because it's a squared factor. We're looking at nearly 5 times faster in terms of the acceleration, and the amount net force about 5 times fast, 5 times more force. So if you put that into context, you've got 1,171 newtons of force being conveyed in the tip of a blade as it strikes a person. It's not pretty. And then we had Sensei, who, because of how he had developed his technique over time and consistent training, we managed to get it down to about 0.36 seconds. And you can see very quickly the orders of magnitude difference between someone who has never swung a sword before and successive years of training. You are dealing with a full order of magnitude difference, conveying a total of 2,443 newtons into a 3-foot long razor blade. It's pretty scary stuff. And this, in a lot of ways, gives us a concept of, and relays back to the cultural aspects of swordsmanship and why it was so important for Japanese society in terms of their warrior class, because there was no give in this. It was life and death. So, my presentation, again, with a lovely video. If you look here, we've got a lectern shadow and some stooge standing up the front. Then we have the conclusions. And this is the conclusions, as I like to call them, the regression to the man. It's a bit of a pun for those of you from the statistics community. Regression to the man. It's interesting because realistically you put it back into the context of you're being conveyed these oral traditions of a technique. And over time, what you are doing is training yourself to be identical to someone else. And this is, part of the process of where essentially swordsmanship will go into the future. As sad as it sounds, one of the reasons why I like doing what I'm doing is because it's helping preserve a piece of history from a country that, dare I say it, the youth these days do not take much of an interest in. Consistent training develops optimal use of leverage. And what we see here is that as the technique in one of the slow-mo videos you would see is that the pivot point for the original part of the cut does not come from the shoulders. And actually, Kiyoshi, if we break it down, has two major parts. One is the acceleration phase, the other part is the falling. It's called falling cut for a reason. And so when you have your blade above your head, it's not about swinging down with your arms. It's actually all in the hands, where you pivot with your left hand. You would create a pivot point here. This allows for the rapid acceleration because the actual amount of mass that you're accelerating initially is only a small amount, and then you can use the potential energy stored in your arms and the mass above your head to then come down and strike your opponent. This is why we see such a great difference in terms of the results that we had there. And by extension of analysis, we can look at this as using a way of understanding how we essentially move in the most efficient manner with human motion. And to conclude my talk, it was really funny because then I was talking to my friends who have come along tonight, and it was really nice to have them along, and they said, so what does this have to do with skepticism? And you know, I was like, actually, that's a really valid point. So I think one of the most interesting things is what we can learn perhaps from the psychology of a battle. In that the Japanese, especially in a duel, it was one strike. And I know, going back onto what Alison was talking about, with their lack of, they don't want to interact and get involved into conversations with anti-vaccine supporters because it doesn't necessarily go anywhere. My thoughts on this would simply be, and they are my own thoughts on this, strike once, strike well, and hit them hard. Get the information down, and do it in such a manner as you maximise the amount of leverage that you can take on this. As Heidi was talking about before, you know, if someone had hit her straight up, chiropractic's bullshit, she would have just dug her heels in. Work out how to leverage it though, through her partner just being gentle and taking the right approach. We actually saw that she was able to come around on her ideas over time. So maybe this is some of the stuff that I would like to relay, and how I can tie it back to skepticism, is that we learn things both from other areas of our life, and there's ways and somehow some absurd analogy to come back to skepticism because it should be such a fundamental part of our lives. All right, guys, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and any questions, I'm more than welcome to have. You've got to swing it.
Yeah. All right. Does anyone have any questions before we move on? Because I'm interested to know, Mythbusters deal with swords a lot.
Yeah.
How do you rate the way they deal with swords? Are they kind of just making guesses, or do you think they have a pretty fair approach when it comes to testing, you know, strength and hitting and all that kind of stuff?
Well, I don't think they're any stooges by any means. I think that they apply scientific principle as best they can in most circumstances. So, but the unfortunate thing is because I've been studying a PhD, I haven't seen Mythbusters for a while. So I don't really have a point of reference there. But if they're trying to cut bullets out of the air, which I think was one of the things they did, yeah, Buckley's chance. But then again, if you put it back into the context of what was occurring in Japanese society at the time, the interesting thing is that firearms were not standard. They were like a make-at-home jobby, you know, and they were a cannon. They weren't just some little sort of 9mm semi-automatic thing. They're dealing with essentially a bore that could be quite big. So it was big and it was slow. It was effective. It carried a lot of mass. So maybe in that context, there would be scope to test things in a little bit more thorough way.
All right. Give it up for Scotty. How interesting was that?
All right. Thanks very much, guys. Thanks, Ross.